This episode, I'm joined by Hans-Georg Moeller, who is a professor at the University of Macau. His research focuses on Chinese and Comparative Philosophy and on social and political thought. Alongside this, he is the host of the Carefree Wandering YouTube channel. In this episode, we discuss the book You and Your Profile, Identity After Authenticity, which he co-authored with Paul J. D'Ambrosio, alongside discussions on sincerity, irony, wokeness, and identification. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible, and if you would like to support Hermetics and gain access to some exclusive content, then please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. Hans-Georg Moeller, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast. We are going to be discussing your book, You and Your Profile, Identity After Authenticity, which was a book which was co-authored, and it was published by Columbia University Press in May this year. And alongside this, we may mention the work on your YouTube channel, which is Carefree Wandering. But before we jump in with the book and the topic of, which is broadly speaking, Profilicity or Profelicity, profiles.
Yeah. Right.
Just tell us a little bit about yourself and how this book came about.
First of all, thanks a lot for having me on your show. It's great that you give me this opportunity to talk to you about some of my ideas. How this book came about. As you said, it's co-written with Paul D'Ambrosio, who used to be a PhD student of mine, and we were working together on Chinese philosophy, on Taoist philosophy. And we wrote a book together. It's called Genuine Pretending. And that's explains our take on Taoist philosophy. So it's a reading of this Taoist text, Zhuangzi, which is like 2,000 years old. We see this text basically as a critique of sincerity and of Confucianism, which means like this old idea, which is very strong until today in Chinese society, that, you develop who you are, you form your identity by sticking to certain social roles. And in China, it's specifically the family roles, right? And but then also other social roles, very patriarchal system and traditional Chinese society thing, right? And Taoism and the Zhuangzi, we think, critiques this idea of forming like an identity in this way. And then by modern Westerners, they often interpret then Taoism, that has been kind of the major interpretation in the modern West, as like a call for being authentic, right? Instead of being yourself and being free and being individualistic somehow, as opposed to like the social roles want you to be. And we thought that's a misunderstanding. So that was the idea of the book, and that instead Taoism is doing something else. It's not telling you to be authentic, but it's telling you that all identity in society is always somehow pretended. It's like pretending in the sense of child play, right? And that the basic idea of Taoism, that it is unhealthy to overly identify with the identities that you have to pretend and learn more and more to pretend. So that's the basic idea of this book, Genuine Pretending, that we are all pretending, and we achieve, so to speak, paradoxically, genuineness, become who we are through pretending. And that the idea within Taoism, which you also find in Buddhism, is not to become authentic, which is just a different way of basically merely pretending, but to understand that any form of identity that we learn to adopt is something that we just acquire while growing up, and that we shouldn't be too much identifying with it, because then we can become whatever, fundamentalist or something. And sorry for speaking so long about it, but you asked about it. So I explained the whole book before it. And so our idea was we have to apply this Taoist approach to identity, to contemporary identity. And so instead of writing a critique, instead of, we basically saying that identity has changed in our society. We are no longer living in times where this kind of role-oriented sincerity is the model. Basically, we're experiencing an interesting period of time nowadays where we, on the one hand, we still have this authenticity idea that, you're supposed to somehow be your true self, find your true self, or create your true self. These are the two forms of authenticity. And we're shifting towards a different identity mode, namely profilicity, that you build identity by creating a profile and building a profile. And so, again, from a Taoist point of view, we wanted to do something like a contemporary Taoism and look at these forms of identity building, again, from the perspective of genuine pretending, and kind of analyzing them from this perspective, and thereby kind of, developing something like a critique of identity. And because identity is such an important thing in our times, right? It's it's like a super important topic in identity politics, both on the left, on the right. It dominates very much our society right now. So that's a long description of how the book came about.
Okay, well, I've enjoyed about 3 fairly big questions from that little introduction alone. But before we, especially around the topic of sincerity, because that's actually what I wrote my thesis on, so I'd be interested to hear your take. Yeah. So, but before we jump headlong into sincerity and authenticity, which are dangerous words in the West, I have to ask you the Hermitix question. You can place 3 thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Who do you pick?
Yes. So for me, they all have to be German so that I really understand what they are saying, right? So I was thinking it'd be Hegel, Nietzsche, and Wittgenstein, because these are probably the German thinkers I studied most. And it would and they're all dead, of course. And so that would be great to actually hear them speaking. And I mean, there are no records of them, right? If you think this was also with a question, like nowadays with contemporary thinkers, we use them. We mentioned video and audio recordings and so forth, but we don't have this of these thinkers, even though they are kind of recent, right? So I'm not aware that there's any recording of Wittgenstein. Maybe there is one, but it would be technically possible. But I've never heard it anyways. And of these others, of course, not. So, yeah, it's a great question. I never thought really about it. So,
if would the room change if everyone in it could just miraculously speak German so you could understand them?
I don't know. I like them to speak in their original language, right? Okay. Especially for philosophy. That's actually something that's very important, I guess.
That's true. A lot of thinkers wouldn't make sense if they were just speaking English, especially.
And I wouldn't understand. I wouldn't be able to understand them that well, right? And that's right. And then through the whole translation thing, yeah. So,
especially with German,
I choose the 3.
Especially with German, it's always a joy. As I only speak English and know English, so it's always a joy to read one German word and then see the footnote, which is half a page. Right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Well, one thing I would say about that room is that's going to be an extremely intense room. I think Nietzsche would probably just be quiet. I think. Do you think Wittgenstein's going to take the floor there?
Well, I mean, I don't know. Wittgenstein was a very not very social. He was basically an asocial person, right? I mean, he lived in this little hut in Norway for most of his life intentionally. And yeah, they're all very different characters. It's very possible that they wouldn't get along, right? Wittgenstein being this kind of loner, and Nietzsche sort of being this eternal juvenile, like kind of a little bit like a teenager mentality. And then Hegel, the established professor at Berlin, and maybe it would be very weird. And maybe, they'd have to drink a beer or 2 before the conversation would get going. But Nietzsche didn't like drinking beer, so
I was going to say as well.
I mean, difficult.
You've got all the different eras, because if it was really young Nietzsche, then he might be fine with a beer, but not later on.
That is true. That is true. Yes.
Okay. I mean that's a very practical room. and maybe those thinkers will come back in. But I'm before I jump in with this first question, I'm actually super interested in your idea of sincerity there. So the conclusion of my own thesis was that it's basically impossible to be sincere anymore, because if you're sincere, it's understood as an ironic sincerity, right? And this was, I was primarily relating this to art. So if someone in the mainstream art world was to paint a nice landscape portrait sincerely, everyone would say, "Oh, they're being ironic." Like, obviously, we don't do that anymore. And do you think that?
Right.
Do you think? I guess there's two questions there. One, do you think sincerity is even a possibility? You know, what is that? And two, if it is a possibility, is it possible anymore?
Yes, I think it is possible, and experiencing it day to day in my life, because I'm in Macau, China, where it still plays a huge role. And so I guess in other societies, Islamic societies, for instance, or other societies that still have like very traditional, also, for instance, I think I've been thinking, for instance, whatever, in organized crime or in the military, right? The sincerity that you stick to your role and that you're non-ironic, that is still, I guess, very important in many of these contexts. So yes, but then I agree with you too. Like for us as Westerners, I mean, we grew up in this culture of authenticity, which basically grew out of the rebellion against sincerity. So that's why we're not really supposed to take sincerity seriously anymore. And I think I didn't really think about it in this way that you described it, but I think it immediately makes perfect sense to me, right? That our way to relate to sincerity is then somehow by default an ironic way, because since to be like only sincere means to be inauthentic, right? It means to be inauthentic, it means that you're not original, that you're not creative, that you're not truly yourself, that you're just following certain roles or conventions or conformity, right? You conform to the genre, right? So if you just paint a realistic painting in a traditional style, you totally lack originality. It's like you're doing whatever, painting by numbers or so. And that can only be seen then once we've gone through authenticity somehow, as it's only possible in a kind of an ironic way. So yeah, that makes total sense to me. It's an interesting point. Like to read your thesis.
It was written a long time ago, but it keeps coming back up. So I mean, that's an interesting position between the two cultures then. Do you think for Westerners, we always, in that case of irony of, you know, not saying what you mean, or a lot of verbal linguistic tricks, or constant even sarcasm, or, you know, almost like Derridian jokes type of thing, we're just constantly in this game of knowing the unsaid thing. Do you think a primary factor of our profiles is the factor which we all know is hidden, the bit that isn't there?
Yes, I mean, I think irony is in one way or another, possible in all the identity modes, but it becomes much stronger in authenticity for the reason you pointed out. Right, and you know, it's again also being like witty, right? That's like original, right? To be original, you have to be witty, right? Whatever this. That's something as a teenager you have to learn if you want to be authentic, right? You have to learn to be witty and critical. And this is how you develop your originality. And I think Profilicity, this goes a step further, right? It's almost second nature, right? It's not something that you do, you know, just from time to time, but and that's something which maybe sort of like, see how advertising changed, right? I remember when I was a kid, or even until I was like 30 or so, speaking of German, right? German advertising was like super serious because, of course, Germans have a big problem being funny, right? Which is also brings us back to the previous question, probably the Hegel, Nietzsche, and Wittgenstein conversation wouldn't be too funny. But anyways, then advertising, right, which is always kind of a very interesting genre to watch, like American advertising that operated a lot with humor and with irony. And of course, advertising is also profile building, right? So this kind of that and on the web and so forth through memes, right? People now and irony has become so much more like a common thing, right? And of course, especially with profilicity, it's a very good point. Very interesting point. I haven't really thought about it. I think it's a super interesting topic.
Okay. Leading into the first question I wrote with regard to these profiles, I was extremely happy to see the book open with a quote from Stoner. I mean, Stoner by John Williams is it's actually my favorite novel. I mean, I don't have a favorite, but if you had to ask me, that would be it. So for those that don't know Stoner, very briefly, it's not about marijuana. It's about a man whose last name is Stoner. And when people ask me to describe it, it's quite difficult because really it's about an average man who pretty much nothing of merit except one tiny event happens to him. His life is really of absolutely no consequence. And it's a fairly miserable life as things go. There's a lot of suffering. Now, the quote itself doesn't matter. What I found interesting is actually the usage of this novel Stoner, because in the text, William Stoner is this who we're trying to avoid being, right? You know, to sort of quote also Thoreau, men lead lives of quiet desperation. Are we, in creating a profile, trying to avoid being that nobody? You know, being that someone who just, they live, they die, and their name is never really seen again?
Yes, that's a good question. I understand now the question, I think, better than I understood it in the beginning. But Stoner, for me, I better agree with how you characterized Stoner. When you were just starting out, what I see in Stoner, right? He's a university professor, so which is this kind of same job as I have, and kind of same age as well, where it's described as our whole age from young to old. But anyways, so for me, his life story describes the same pattern which we have in many novels of the 20th century, even of the 19th century, the conflict between sincerity and authenticity. That's a major theme, I think, of the novel, next to the one that you were discussing. Again, like, because he takes on the job, right, and he has a marriage, and then he falls in love with this younger woman, right? And so that conflicts with both his marriage and his job. And is he willing to kind of, becoming a social scandal or not? Is he willing to kind of stand up and be authentic? Or is he giving in to the sincerity pressures? And he kind of wavers back and forth, but in the end, the social pressure is so strong and he kind of sticks to sincerity. So this conflict between sincerity and authenticity, I think, is the conflict, as I said, I think, of Western modernity in the 19th and 20th century. So that's what I see in the novel Stoner, in between sincerity and authenticity, right? And then, but you are perfectly right that profilicity plays no role in this book. And somehow, in Profilicity, we all, we follow the model of the celebrity, right? We turn ourselves into small-scale celebrities. And if we're lucky, like you and I with our social media activity, we become a little bit bigger. Yeah, I also don't know about lucky, but then we build like a profile, and we are successful, more successful than most others in actually building a profile identity that now everyone strives for. Which brings us back to the book. That's why we quote him right at the beginning, right, where he looks into the mirror. and finds it difficult to identify with the face he sees in the mirror, which I think is an absolutely essential existential experience for everyone, right? And so in this moment, when you look into the mirror and find it difficult to identify with the face that you're seeing there, you experience the moment you see that you're genuinely pretending. You see that the identity that the face is seen with, that you're seeing, is built on some form of social technology that makes this face somehow the face of a specific person who has a specific identity in society, right? Who is seen in this way as society, either in the mode of sincerity or in the mode of authenticity or in the mode of profilicity. So that's why we start with this specific quote, because it expresses a kind of a raw experience that existence is genuine pretending, and that no matter if you use sincerity, authenticity, or, which wasn't available to Stoner, profilicity, that it's always somehow a performed, presented identity.
Do you, when you watch your videos back, do you feel that same existential dread?
Sort of. In the beginning, that was a big thing for me. I have a problem since many years seeing my image on a photo or on even in the mirror. I cannot telling this to you now is a very private thing, but I have like a kind of I have a real problem seeing my image in the mirror or on photos. So people show me photos, and I always try to look and not look at the photos at the same time. So that was a big thing for me in the past year, to basically go through this process of getting used to watch my image, which also in the beginning was, we did some editing mistakes also because I just didn't want to watch the video, right? Because I have to look at myself all the time. Now through this kind of constant work with this medium and with this YouTube genre, I got used to it. It just kind of worked. But you're right. Then I experienced basically this same problem, this kind of odd way of seeing oneself as one is being seen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what do you think the difference is then between genuine pretending and like a form of being a sociopath, right?
I think everyone is always genuine pretending, right? So that is and that's not sociopathological at all. Mm-hmm. Again, we have to pretend, and that's not a bad thing. We perform, or sociologists presenting selfhood. You know, we have to build a self that functions in society. And in this performance, through this pretense, if we identify with a persona, if we identify with the face in the mirror, like Stoner, and then we have different technologies to achieve this, then we become genuine. Mm. That's the only way. We're not genuine to begin with. We're nothing to begin with, right? And we need to identify with the face in the mirror. And once we achieve that identification, right, this is a genuine pretense that we all need to function in society, and not to be sociopaths, but opposite, to need to be healthy, to be sane. But I think, and that's a Taoist idea, that that it's more sane and we can achieve more ease if we understand both the genuine and the pretense thing. And if we don't, because that means that we understand that we cannot never be like fully sincere. We cannot, the roles do not, they are just a social performance. They do not like constitute a true self. Just like even the authenticity doesn't constitute a true self. And of course, profilicity also doesn't constitute like a true self in that sense. So it prevents identity fundamentalism. And for Paul and me, this notion of genuine pretending is like the existential condition of everyone. And if we understand it in a Taoist and Buddhist way, because I think Buddhism is very similar, mm-hmm. we see the ambiguity of selfhood. And this allows us to kind of play our roles be ourselves, curate our profiles with more ease, without being fake.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. I actually see there that this is something which seems possibly for us quite contemporary. It seems to actually be reaching back to possibly the oldest clear debate we have in philosophy between Heraclitus and Parmenides. Between you say that you can never reach full sincerity. This seems to be the discussion between being and becoming. And what do you think happens to an identity when it believes it's become solidified in being, right? That there's no more change.
Then pathologies very easily arise. Then the pathologies arise. When you fully identify, right? It leads, like in the Confucian context, to arrogance, right? Those who identify with their patriarchal role in society is still super common in China. Sorry. And, right. And it leads to the opposite, to, like, for instance, in the lower roles for women, especially, right? It leads basically to institutionalized pathological feeling of having less self-worth, right? For those who are lower in the hierarchy. And then, with authenticity or whatever, it leads to all these kind of crazy people who are kind of so full of themselves in authenticity. So, and of course, in sincerity also it can lead to fundamentalism, right? Whatever, honor killings or so, right? That you have to defend the honor of your family to such an extent, or the honor of your nation, right? In America also, there can be also like some form of sincerity, fundamentalism, and I think in all of these modes, and it's also, of course, very obvious in Profilicity, right? Which is often called Narcissism, then, right? The whole that's a kind of a term that we now often hear.
It's almost impossible for a reversion out of that state as well.
Yes,
so, it's one of the biggest psychological quandaries, right? How do you drag a horse to water, but you can't make it drink?
Yes.
So do you believe we're fully blank state and that there's no amount of, say, hereditary traits or
no, of course there are.
I mean, at the beginning.
Of course, we have personality, whatever, and that these differ from one another. Of course, I've now started working with a psychologist. No, that's of course all given, but we don't have, like, in that sense, we don't really have like an identity. Like we don't have a complete kind of personal, just like, it's a good question. Like, whatever, how you are a father, how you are a husband, how you are a friend. These notions of husband, father, friend, or how you're a professor, how you're a YouTuber, that is not something that you can find through personality traits. This is kind of a complex thing that has to do with all how society is built up. And so society has to build a framework, has to build, as whatever Goffman, the sociologist, would say, a stage. And this stage is social, and the role that you bring everything, you bring your whole body, which of course you're born with, and you bring your brain chemistry that you're born with, and you bring your personality traits that you acquired when you were a small baby, or so you bring all this on the stage. But the stage, with the different roles on the stage and the kind of the instruction, this is how you have to play on the stage. And this is what comes from society. And this is not something and this is how you build identity. The mere body and the mere brain chemistry and the mere personality traits that you develop when you're a small child, they do not yet constitute an identity. The identity is all this together as a player on the stage. So that's what I mean by identity.
Okay, that makes more sense.
Yeah.
So what happens when we could say somewhat universal or sort of cornerstone values of society, virtue, ethics, morality, what it is to be good, what it is to be true, what it is to be, perhaps even pious. what happens when these are subsumed entirely into your identity? But I guess the problem is the reasons as to why you are doing those things. Are they to do with
exactly, because it's the identity technologies, sincerity, authenticity, and now profilicity that create the values, right? In sincerity, you need to be honest. You need to be a good father. Need to be a good mother. You need to be a good teammate. You need to be a good soldier. So all these kind of values, you need to, whatever, Aristotle, you need to be courageous in war, and right, and all these things that are generated, specifically this honor thing, right? That is very much, I think, honor is a core sincerity value, then in authenticity, everything changes, and everything just means you have to be original and unique and yourself, and otherwise you're fake, right? And you don't have to be a good mother. It's much more important that you realize your own inner potentials and be honest in that sense, than honest, that you only say what you think, right? Because traditionally honest means that if you're a shopkeeper, then you have to make an honest price, and whatever. It means that you stick to your role in the honest sense. And now everything has only value if it's kind of individual. I experienced this conflict, by the way, the value conflict. I even had a discussion today, because again, I'm teaching in China, right? Even though Macau is, that's anyway. So the students here think that, for instance, somehow plagiarizing, what we call plagiarizing, is somehow okay, because they just honestly, from their perspective, just give you the correct answer, and they do their best to find, to repeat exactly what someone else said. That's honest. They don't change it, right? That's very honest to say exactly what the teacher said, right? You can't be more honest to the authority to just repeat exactly their words, right? And then we have to tell them as Westerners, no, that's really bad. The value is you have to be original. You have to say it like no one else says it, right? So it's the notion of, it's dishonest if you just say exactly the same thing, right? In order to be honest now, under conditions of authenticity, you have to be original, unique, like no one else, right? So that kind of totally changes. These values change radically along with the different identity technologies. And then again, now with Profilicity, it's good if it somehow sticks out, if it's cool. Has to be somehow cool. What you say has to be, has to be whatever, politically correct. That's a negative term, but in this sense, it has to be, but it has to be somehow. So it's changing the value. In order for something, to get a lot of likes, or for a meme to be popular, it's something different. It has neither to be honest in the traditional sense that, nor can it be just like completely unique. It has to be it has to somehow be cool. That is, it has to. Then I'm still looking for a vocabulary for this kind of for the values of Profilicity.
Well, I think I would say that seems insincere, because it seems at that point that the identity becomes the end in itself, right? So you're no longer being virtuous because you're truly virtuous, but you're being virtuous because you understand that that's going to benefit and bolster this identity which you've formed. In the same way that you're then trying to be original, not because you're actually original, but because this is what your identity calls for. So there isn't really a teleology or an aim. It's because there's some identity there, and that is the end that you need to keep. So I think I would argue that seems to do a lot of damage to what it is to be authentic, because you're only doing it for the continuation.
Well, of course, I mean, from
the
perspective of authenticity, profile building is morally problematic for exactly the reasons you say. It's inauthentic, right? And this is why people who are like a little bit older, like myself, and maybe you're also not like 20 years old anymore. So, and we still have this kind of, and that's a common complaint about it is the most common complaint about Profilicity that it lacks authenticity. But again, the same thing happened when there was a switch from sincerity to authenticity, right? The women were no longer good housewives, and in this sense, they were being, dishonest because they were not living up to the role. So from this perspective, authenticity was at the beginning also morally scandalous for those who are still identifying mostly with the sincerity paradigm. And I think something similar is happening now when where we are measuring profilicity, like I think you just did, with the morality and the values that come from authenticity. And of course, they do not fulfill these values. But there is no such thing. There is no neutral ground. If what I just said is correct, that all the values are grounded in an identity paradigm that is the dominating one for yourself, then you always judge the other identity paradigms as somehow lacking in morality. So authenticity is by definition insincere, right? Because that's what authenticity essentially is. You're no longer allowing the role to define your identity. So authenticity is thoroughly insincere in that sense, right? And that's why it's scandalous from the perspective of traditional societies. And the authenticity people intentionally wanted to provoke society, whatever, Sartre and so forth, right? And I think now we're seeing something similar with the shift from authenticity to profilicity, that it brings us directly what you said back at the beginning, also with this kind of new form of kind of irony, where when with the landscape painting or so, right, like all the gestures are somehow ironic, or many gestures are somehow ironic and reflect thereby on somehow the impossibility to be truly authentic, or in the kind of lie that is in being authentic. Whatever, you can't really be a hippie anymore, right? Hippies were like very authentic, but now we look at hippies and look at them a little bit as a joke or so, right? And if you do that, you're already somehow in the level of, I think, of profilicity. And somehow profilicity is, in this sense, more honest because it openly communicates that it is not authentic. So let me explain this maybe most best with a picture that we use in the book, which is of several people jumping together on a beach. Right? That is a typical picture that you would post on an Instagram account or so, right? And it is very clear that the people are not jumping authentically. They jump because they're just taking the picture, and everyone knows that. So, and if you have just a merely truly authentic picture, that's impossible to have, right? All photos are somehow staged. So it is more honest because you're talking about values, that at the same time you somehow openly communicate that the picture is being staged. You don't fake authenticity. And that's why we use this picture of the people jumping simultaneously at the beach. And that's profilicity, that you are aware that basically every picture you post as being part of your profile on Instagram. And in China, that's, we have this other chapter at the book where everyone knows that all pictures are photoshopped, often for like very long periods of time. But that's not a secret, right? That's everyone knows that everyone is doing this, that everyone is curating their pictures, and no one tries to be merely authentic. And those who try to be merely authentic come across as somehow posers, imposters of authenticity.
Yeah. So it's almost a reversal of the simulacra and the real.
Yes,
the simulacra becomes so dense that we just accept that as the real.
Exactly.
And to venture into the real is suspicious. Why would you want to do that when we have so much knowledge, when we know on a meta level what we're doing here?
Exactly. It's exactly the point. Yes.
That seems quite dangerous in the long run, though. It seems you could lose yourself.
Only from the perspective of authenticity. And I mean, that's the interesting thing, because simulacrum, right, is Baudrillard's term, and they all share what you just said. They thought somehow everyone's simulacra, but it's bad. We should all somehow go back to authenticity. But we've moved on from that. We're no longer living in the 1970s. We're no longer kind of hippies anymore. We have now accepted, yes, a simulacra it just works fine, and it works in our society just better.
Okay. I think I'm in agreement with you, but I think it poses some social and political problems in relation to time. In that, as you said, even something as close as the 70s, we could take hippies, we could take sort of Reaganite capitalists.
Right.
And we could keep going back. You'd say, if someone said, I'm a monarchist, I'm a feudalist, I'm a minarchist or something like this, or any social movement that's pre-1970, we would think, they're doing so. No one's a monarchist today, not sincerely. So it can this form of sort of profilicity as it's happening, is sort of cancelling the future as it's going forward. But ultimately, that only leaves the horizon of what's here now, which really is basically just capitalism. So it seems it doesn't expand our horizons in that sense. It seems to just be homogenizing them.
That's a very good point, and I think you're absolutely right about the very close connection between hypercapitalism and profilicity. And I also see lots of huge problems with profilicity, but there are also huge problems with all the other models, right?
Mm-hmm.
With,
sure.
The fundamentalism of sincerity and this hyper-individualism, right, of authenticity, which can also be politically very problematic. Anyway, so yes, I do see that, and I think that's a very good point, and that's why we must understand it's genuine pretending, and it's very dangerous, right? And like the other technologies too. Yes, I agree with that. But profilicity, I think, maybe more than the others, allows us to see the playfulness of identity, right? We become less identity fundamentalists, right? It's fine for us and for others to have multiple, often incommensurable profiles or so. We're not so much identity totalitarians. We can develop kind of a more easygoing, a more forgiving approach to identity, right? Think about this identity pressures, again, back to Stoner. Mm-hmm. He's experiencing the identity pressures of sincerity. So that means he cannot love the love of his life. He is in his job. He has these problems with the department all the time, and that's like super frustrating. So he's crushed by sincerity pressures, but he's also crushed, as you described it, by the authenticity pressures, because he knows he was not original. Mm-hmm. He didn't write the original book. He did not, right? That was his great dream, as it is of every young man and woman, under authenticity, because it's what your parents tell you, what society tells you. You're original, you're unique, you're special. And then you find out in your life, you're not special at all. That's exactly how you described Stoner. So he's suffering not only from the sincerity pressure, he's also suffering from the authenticity pressure. In the end, kind of giving up, dying there with his book that no one read in his hand, falling out of his hands, and I'm the failure. I did not become anyone special. I did not become unique. I was basically just a loser. And of course, under conditions of authenticity, that is something that everyone faces. And now, as we said, exactly brings us back to the beginning of the conversation, right? Everyone is a little celebrity, which is, of course, from a capitalist perspective, very problematic. But it also has this kind of a playful relief from the pressures of authenticity. You can be like special on your little whatever Facebook or TikTok and so forth thing, and you don't have to be authentic, and you can have an ease and fun kind of experience of profile play, and you don't have to be the superstar. You don't have to be super original, right? Mm-hmm. You don't have to be like Stoner, right? You couldn't write the book that would revolutionize. He was in English literature, right? Mm-hmm. The reading of 19th century British literature. No, there's very few people who can do that, right? Mm-hmm. So, and with Profilicity, we can create all kinds of different profiles. Like we have a chapter in the book about electronic musicians. Mm-hmm. A colleague of mine wrote about that, and that's for them. It's kind of, they can perform under different pseudonyms, under different stage names. Like often on one night, they have like 3 or 4 different musicians that they can perform, and none of them they have to identify too closely. Often they're not even, their real name is not known, and they change personas and so forth. And so this also has a lot of, let's say, creative potential. Mm-hmm. Once we are set free from the pressures of authenticity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There seems to be a dangerous expansion with that, though, in terms of your almost like social like credits. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that if it's sort of the postmodern problem again, right? If everyone has an award, no one has an award. If everyone is famous, no one's really famous. But that equally consistently turns up your sort of desire to grow your profile. So
I'm not sure. Again, where you could argue, I'm just being the devil's advocate here, right? I fully admit Profilicity is as much problematic as the other two, but it also has positive functions. And so why isn't that, for instance, somehow socialist more? Right, that was the vision of, I don't know, like Benjamin's vision when he wrote the work of art under conditions of technical reproduction, right? That everyone can become an artist. Mm-hmm. That's for the first time that this is public. It's no longer a bourgeois thing. You don't even need to have like a prime education or anything, right? You just know how to use the technology, which now all the kids learn when they basically go out, and they already have like they can't even read, and they already have like a device in their hand and stuff like this. So it has what the socialist and communist thinkers said. They use this vocabulary, has lots of egalitarian potential, emancipatory potential, and I think there is a point there. Because authenticity is terribly bourgeois.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but equally, doesn't that lead into a relativism where things the value becomes like hyper subjective, which could be seen as good.
Yes,
personally,
exactly.
I'd see it as bad, but
yeah. But we no longer have, like, which was of course somehow idiotic than you had in socialism, going back to art and creativity, right? Then you had communism, and you had communist societies in Russia and in China, and then you had socialist realism, which was extremely kind of, the government tells you exactly what you do. There's very little freedom, and everything was very uniform and so forth, right? And it was the opposite. But now it's actually this kind of, to a certain extent, this has become much more a reality that, that everyone can produce like somehow their own artworks. Well, of course, the artworks are often from a traditional art perspective, not very. They're not elitist art, but that's exactly what they're not supposed to be. And so that there can still be elitist art, but the elitist art no longer has the elite status. Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, and I live with it. I'm going back to my own experience as a YouTuber. Right. And so because it's my profile, right, that's why it's directly to do with the question you asked earlier, that I don't mind really seeing my face that much because I don't take it so seriously, because I know it's a profile. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I mean, I have whatever. I'm also very nervous. I always want to get more and more views. That's normal. But then I don't really feel as if I was a celebrity at the same time, right? I know that whatever, if I would be able to sing like some sort of stupid, what is this music now called? The most fashionable, the reggaeton song or something like this, I would get like 1 billion views. I can't sing a reggaeton song, but right. So, and it doesn't, that doesn't bother me, right? That I don't have as many views as the reggaeton music videos have. So that's, again, I think there is a greater potential to be at ease with one's identity or one's multiple identities under conditions of profilicity. We just have to learn it.
Okay. So perhaps what I would state is dangerous then is because, for instance, take our 2 profiles, Hermitix and Carefree Wandering. Right. When you look at that, because of the name, because of the sculpture of it, you understand this is a profile. You're on that meta level of understanding the simulacrum. But what seems to be dangerous is things like Facebook, where it's a profile which is disguising itself as completely that person in real right. It's their real name, and it's not seen. The picture isn't seen as an avatar. It's not seen as sculpted in any form. Like that is them compared to Twitter, where you're called whatever, like Cool Dog 44.
Right.
That's a profile, etc.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. I think we have to learn to accept this or live with it, and I think it's a good thing. I think there's lots of potential there, but not in a fake way, right? That's I don't think what you or I are doing on the podcast or in the videos is fake, right? But it's not fake at all. But at the same time, it's not all that we are, and we know it is a performance, and it couldn't be otherwise.
So do you think there can be such a thing as a fake profile?
Look, for instance, you gave me the questions. I asked you to give me the questions. Now we're communicating it to the viewers. Is this fake? No, it's not fake. Gives me time. You thought about the questions, gives me more time, and then I can think about the questions and so forth. And that it's just like photoshopping, or it's just like the people jumping at the beach, right? We're creating a certain profile, just like we're creating a picture, and that and it's not fake, right? It's not fake. It's not more fake than trying to be the absolute original self, which doesn't exist. So I think that it brings us back to what we said earlier, because it's kind of somehow taken for granted in the medium, curation, right? Curation is taken for granted in the medium, and that takes away the fakeness.
Okay. But perhaps let's take the example of something that I'm very happy that someone out there is tackling, which you're tackling on Carefree Wandering, which is these YouTube influencers who are utilizing quote unquote philosophy as a means to bolster their identity. Do you, what do you see that as having harmful effects towards what is commonly understood as philosophy? What's going on there in terms of profilicity?
Yes, that is. I do think it's partly problematic, and I mean it's just like another thing that is. I think it's very similar to corporate wokeness, right? This phenomenon that I think about recently, like corporations who create their identity through advertising that shows them as being woke. And I think that is happening also on a very large scale for people on social media, including certain philosophy channels, which I do not want to name here. But I think it is clear that just as and the people, I don't blame them morally. I'm not a moralist, right? I fully trust that they do this kind of, that they have internalized it very much, and then they know, like, if I pose like in a certain sense and present myself in a certain way and embrace these or those positions, that will make my profile flourish. So that is, of course, something that, again, that happens under all identity technologies. And that's why I think we need the reflection on genuine pretending. We need to fess up to the fact that we are curating ourselves. And again, I think Profilicity allows us more than the other identity technologies to fess up that identity, the fact that identity is a construct. But still, in most profile performance, there is, as you say, the danger or the what is the word? The hybris. You can hubris. Be the hubris. How do you pronounce this?
Yeah, hubris.
The hubris, yes, the hubris of that this is somehow not just a curation.
Is there anything about Profilicity you feel we've sort of ignored, or anything about the book you'd like to add in?
I feel now that, but I think it's important with what I did to look at, to use Nietzsche, to look at all these identity technologies beyond good, from perspective beyond good and evil. I don't want to moralize them. And if you moralize them, you basically can only do it by identifying with one of them, right? And if you identify with authenticity, then both sincerity and Profelicity are inauthentic. If you identify with sincerity, then both Profelicity and authenticity are insincere. Now, and so I want to get out of this value. I don't want to be judgmental, right? I think that's what is important. But, and as I say it in the book, I even said it in the Peterson video, and kind of my new motto: be critical but not judgmental. So I want I think the task of philosophy and my channel also is to be critical towards these identity modes, right? So I don't want to say, of course, I do not want to say become like a Profilicity fundamentalist, or Profilicity is great or Profilicity is better than the others. I do not believe that, right? But maybe in Profilicity, we have a better chance to be more critical. It's easier to be critical, but maybe not. I'm not sure about that, right? Because, and I think that's, again, ties into what I just said. If you over-identify with your profile, you're no longer critical. Right. So so I think that's like in a sincerity culture, whatever, again, in some religious Islamist culture or so, it's very difficult to be critical, right? Whatever, it's very difficult to be humorous. If you make a cartoon, if you make a joke, you're already like a really bad person, and you can't really criticize anything. And and develop a critical distance to these pressures. And I hope we can maybe do that in Profilicity. So that's something I think I would like to highlight. This kind of, if I had a motto, I would choose maybe critical but not judgmental.
Okay. It seems quite difficult then to develop, say, a political position, but I guess it's healthier to stay open and becoming, as opposed to, as you say, becoming pathological.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I do have certain political preferences.
Mm-hmm.
Like I would like more socialism, for instance, because I grew up with it in Germany, and then it was all dismantled. And by this, I mean that there is a public health service, there's public education, that there's public energy supply, that maybe even many banks are somehow public, and so forth, public transportation. I think that was a very good model that, because of hyper-capitalism, has now been increasingly abandoned. And I think that's also been very good about China, by the way, because it allowed millions and billions of people to have much better life and whatever, access to education, just what I'm talking about, right? So I don't know how you look skeptical. Maybe you're on the other side of the political spectrum, but I do not think that this has much to do with. I think these are kind of more, for me at least, they are not, I do not, again, it is not something that I identify with. I think it's a good idea to have that, but I'm not identifying as a socialist, just as whatever someone would identify to be a Muslim, right? So I think that's a good thing to treat politics in that way. I don't want to, just as whatever, if you are, I don't know, it's not maybe a good example, but, if you develop a certain technology to, build machines or so, right? And then that doesn't necessarily mean that you identify with this technology in the same that you identify with the religion you practice. And unfortunately, we approach politics often, which I think is a bad thing, more like we approach a religion rather than we approach a certain technology that we use when we are building a house or when we are playing football, for that matter.
I think that's that seems like a good place to finish up. I think we've covered most of the bases.
We did.
I think I've realized I'm an elitist, so there you go. Yeah. So what are you working on any books at the moment, or are you still continuing on the identity trajectory?
Yes, I started a project with a psychologist in German who works with transsexuals, and so that's potentially a high profile topic. So that's something we're kind of tinkering with, and maybe it will grow into a serious research project.
Is that
so? Sexual identity, sexual identity, including transsexual identity.
Is there a vague sort of thesis at the moment, or is it just an investigation into it?
Yes, I can already tell you the basic idea is it follows the same model we've been talking about throughout the whole show, from gender role to gender profile. That also that gender is now also an important aspect of profile building and of profilicity. So we want to understand gender from the perspective of profilicity.
Okay. I imagine that book's quite a way off.
Yeah.
Okay. We can obviously find your work at Carefree Wandering, and I know the book is available on Amazon, and I imagine from Columbia University Press website, and probably many good bookstores. But yeah, anything else we need to know?
No, thank you very much. It was great talking to you.
Okay. Hans-Georg, thanks very much.
Thank you.